Thanks, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today in another episode of Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. It's really great to be here again, and today with some technical issues as we are using our new studio, brand new studio, our stream, and hopefully Martin Duffy will be able to connect in a few minutes. And in the meantime, I have already our guest speakers for today here with us to discuss the impact of culture on well-being. And it's great to have here Anthony and Pernilla. They will be shortly introducing themselves and asking each of them, and perhaps starting on alphabetical order. Anthony, you first, then Pernilla. If you be so kind, when you introduce yourselves, also to share something that you normally don't disclose in this kind of.
I don't know what happened.
I think we might have lost Paul, but that's fine. I'm really happy to introduce myself and say something I don't normally say. So I'm Anthony. I run an organisation here in Brussels called Democratic Society. We work on democratic participation and citizen participation. So obviously we do a lot of facilitation, we run a lot of meetings, and the sort of thing that wouldn't normally come up in this kind of environment is that I'm one of the owners of Exeter City Football Club, which is a second division club in the UK. So it's a League Two club in the UK. And we work on, and we are a supporter-owned club, and I've been a member of the Supporters Trust since the club was bought by the supporters a few years back. So yes, it doesn't normally come up, but I think it's a big part of my inspiration for democratic and citizen action.
That's amazing. How about you, Pernilla?
Well, my name is Pernilla Rorso, and I'm half Swedish, half Danish. I also have American relatives. I'm with an organization by the name of Hofstede Insights. And a lot of you probably heard the name Hofstede before. So Geert Hofstede, or Professor Geert Hofstede, was my mentor and also friend. And I work with culture, and that's both national culture, organizational culture, management. It could be anything. It could be mergers, acquisitions. It could be leadership, global leadership, and so on, running projects across cultures. And I've done research also on well-being and health. And the last thing I did was also looking at the different corona approaches across cultures. So something that wouldn't normally come up. I'm probably the only Dane that didn't really bike until maybe a year ago. So, and everyone tells me, well, you are not a proper Dane then. So, yeah.
That's lovely. And I'm glad that Martin managed to join us. Hi, Martin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for being delayed. Technology got in the way this time, I'm afraid.
Yes, and we are always facing these issues. But we can roll up the program now. And Martin, over to you, perhaps to kickstart the discussion.
Sure, yeah. It's Pernilla and Anthony, thank you very much for joining Paul and myself. My apologies again for being late with the technology. It just wouldn't connect me in for some reason or other. I suppose just by way of introduction, Paul, I'm not sure if you've gone through the format with Pernilla and Anthony.
Not really, but you can proceed with that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Just the format that we take, guys. We call it a fireside chat. Because literally that's what we try to achieve. So we don't do any detailed preparation. We don't have any pre-prepared questions. We just have a theme or a topic, and we normally like to have a conversation with experts under the particular theme and see where that conversation takes us. Okay. This particular topic, actually, it came out of our previous discussion last month, and the central theme was well-being, and very broadly, well-being and the significance of it. But what came out of it was a question around culture and organization culture and the impact that organization culture might have on well-being and the significance of that question. So we thought that could be an interesting conversation to have with experts like yourselves. So I suppose I'd just open it to the floor. Do you have any immediate observations or questions or ideas, comments about
Let me just ask you a question. So when you say culture, you mean primarily organizational culture or national culture or both?
I would say both because, and this is an interesting and subtle differentiation, Pernille. Maybe you can enlighten us a little bit on that because, as I think, culture is perhaps this kind of big concept that encompasses everything else. And if you think about the mechanisms of culture, then they probably have different kinds of adaptation according to the level of social interactions we are talking about, right? In that sense, maybe we can have even a couple culture, right? A couple culture, a family culture, organizational culture, and country culture. But maybe it's the same phenomena, right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely culture, you have a lot of different levels. So whether it be national, ethnicity, be regional, whether it be gender, occupational, and so on, organizational. And broadly speaking, you can say that Hofstede, he defined culture, national culture then, as the collective programming of the human mind that differentiates one group of people from other group of people. And that's primarily made up by our values. So that's really the core of culture. Organizational culture, on the other hand, has more to do with practices. And it's basically how people in an organization which relate to their tasks, they relate to other people and the outside world compared to other organizations. So I'll just repeat. So national culture, regional culture, and so on will be primarily related to values. And organizational culture will primarily be related to practices. Another thing I think I should mention is that well-being is also a really broad topic, but basically there are two different concepts that are being talked about, and one is the cognitive well-being in a cognitive kind of way, and the other one is affect, so emotions. So the cognitive perspective looks at well-being from a life satisfaction perspective. So, how satisfied are you with your life? And the cognitive, the affect aspect looks at emotions. So you have both positive effect and you have negative effect. So positive effect, that could be feelings of joy, and negative effect could be feelings of depression, neuroticism, and so on. I don't know if that helps or just to kickstart the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Anthony, do you want to pick up on anything that Pernilla said there?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about culture for me is how much quiet impact it has. So, one of the things you heard me say is that I work on democratic participation and citizenship. And that comes from my background as a civil servant, but also as someone who's always been really interested in politics. And one of the things that I've noticed as I've done this work over the last 15 years is that I started out with quite a kind of mechanistic view of how decisions get taken, and quite a kind of engineering, I suppose, view of the processes through which government gets decisions done. And as I've kind of worked with these decision-making processes for longer and longer, I've realised how much the culture and the cultural aspects are actually almost more important than some of the processes that lead to those decisions. Not just in terms of who is talked to, but also what they're talked to about and the ways in which people are listening. So, so having worked primarily on processes over the last 10 years, I think our next 10 years is going to largely be working on cultures within organisations and within citizen groups to help people take decisions better. And I think, I see it in my own organisation as well. So I'm about 50, so I'm maybe 25 years out from my first job. And the people who I'm hiring who are straight out of university have totally different cultural starting points from me. Partly because they have a different experience of history. For them, things like the fall of the Berlin Wall, which were hugely motivating for my involvement in politics, are like distant past. They're as much distant to them as things like the Korean War crisis were to me from 1973. But at the same time, you have a lot more, some very more open values. You have a lot more open conversation about things like gender roles and around power, which I think has been occasionally difficult for me to take on board as an organisational leader. But I think it's become a much better organisation in terms of its culture when we've kind of stepped back a little bit from the traditional roles that we've kind of been running for the last 10 years and started to think about how our culture can be shifted in line with the cultural values of the people who are arriving in it, who obviously will be the people who will be taking over the organisation, hopefully, in 5, 10, 15 years. So I do think that those kind of cultures shift you. You can shift cultures within your organisation, but you are also very much driven by the wider societal changes around you. And I think if you can align yourselves right with that, you can create an atmosphere of well-being, but you can also create an atmosphere in which people feel free to make themselves heard in the right way. Last point I'll make before maybe throwing it back again is there are places, and we've seen them in our own organisation sometimes, but elsewhere as well, where cultures are out of alignment, not because of national boundaries, although we do have lots of different European countries in our network, but more because of different starting points and philosophical priors. And it can be really hard to manage some of the cultural conflict that comes from that because it is so genuine, and it's meant from a very deep place and from a very personal view. And trying to understand how you shape that while also being respectful of those cultural values and not trying to impose a kind of, very kind of bureaucratic, hierarchical view, that has been quite difficult for us. And I think that's one of the areas where attempting to improve well-being through cultural alignment can produce something that is maybe, for those people who don't share the majority culture, can be quite difficult.
Yeah, like that prompts me to wonder about, I suppose, separating out the two ideas of well-being and culture just initially, because I think both of you have identified that under well-being, there are different perspectives, there are different perceptions or different, let's say, definitions of well-being. But then equally, from a cultural point of view, Pernilla, particularly you made the point, we've got organization culture, we've got national culture, two very distinct, very different things. We can extend that into professional cultures, group cultures, and so on. So could I kind of switch to the well-being piece just initially? Could I just put a question to you both? Would you agree or disagree that over the last, say, I don't know, let's take a 10-year time frame for the moment. Would you agree that broadly, very broadly speaking, that the well-being of people in organizations has progressively declined over the last 10 years? Would you think that's a fair comment, or is that an unfair comment? Very broadly.
That's a good question. And again, I think sorry. Do you want to start, Anthony? Or I can start.
No, it's fine. So I'm an optimist, right? So I work on democracy, so you can't work on democracy and not be an optimist. And I would certainly feel that it has improved overall.
Okay.
Not so much that this goes back to the question about what is driven by society and what is driven by the organisation. But if I look around the organisations that I know best, the UK civil service, local government, and the NGO sector, although there is an increasing amount of workload pressure, which is a problem, which is definitely on the negative side of the balance sheet, I think there is also a lot more openness and flexibility to people's personal circumstances. So, when I was a young civil servant and had kids 20 years ago, it was a little unusual that I was keen to take to work like 4 days a week or 1 day from home and things like that. And it was like, oh, do you have to? Really? Oh, we're going to have to do all this setup for you. It's really tiresome. So yeah, I think there is some of that that does help well-being. It helps well-being in a kind of quite a quiet way. Maybe it's not very noticeable because people are it's easier for people to do the things they want to do. And then I think there is a question about whether that flexibility has led to an expectation of availability that has led to higher workloads and stress and pressure. So I do think it goes both ways. But I tend to see the glass as half full rather than half empty.
Okay, interesting. Pernilla?
That's also a cultural aspect. So indulgence versus restraint, that cultural dimension correlates with optimism. So, and the UK is indulgent as a culture. I would say this is a very complex question, and there are so many things playing into it. One is that it depends on the national culture. You have to look at both aspects, right? Or several levels at the same time, because they are different, yeah, but they impact on each other. So, or the national culture has an effect on the organizational culture, of course. Um, it depends on the nation. And I would also say that there are different aspects to it. And I think, Anthony, that's also what you were touching upon. And again, it differs according to the country. So, for instance, you look at the focus now in some countries on gender issues, gender equality, equality of LGBT, and so on. So, in that sense, yes, it has improved. But at the same time, in several countries where this has not been maybe the norm previously, where people they work to live, you also see that people are getting busier at work. They have to perform more. And again, you cannot generalize across cultures. So you have
Yeah.
to look at the different countries to look at this. So, and we also know that one of the cultural dimensions of uncertainty avoidance that correlates with the extent to which people feel very stressed at work and anxious. And uncertainty avoidance, compared to a lot of the other cultural dimensions, is not really a dimension where we see any changes, really big shifts. So, in that sense, and then you, of course, have cultures where they have always, it's really in their culture to work a lot. So, I mean, again, it really depends on what you're looking at. And it also comes down to how do you define well being? And how do you define well being in organizations? And are you defining it as people who are, that you can see it on engagement, for instance? Engagement, because we know that engagement scores in a lot of countries are really poor. Yeah. So again, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. It partly does, but it begs another question then. So if we're looking at, if I'm interpreting correctly, very broadly, I think both of you are saying that national culture kind of feeds into organizational culture, and then
Yeah.
organizational culture feeds into well-being. Now, there's a lot of caveats. There's a lot of sub questions about defining culture or defining well-being, and that's probably a very broad spectrum. But the question that what both of you have said there is begging in my mind is, so which culture is national culture or organizational culture having more of an impact on the overall well-being of people, or are they roughly 50-50?
Well, that's a good question. And again, it depends. I know I say that a lot. But if you think about what things correlate with the different types of well being, so for instance, work satisfaction obviously will be more strongly correlated with organizational culture and also, of course, professional culture. But if you look at national culture, that will be, we know that one of the things that is very strongly correlated with national culture is the extent to which people feel that they have free choice and control over their own lives. So that will, does not necessarily, well, of course, a little bit, relates to the organizational culture, the work environment. But even holding that constant, you will still see that this is a national culture aspect. So again, but
Yeah.
there are so many correlates with these different types of cultures. So it's really difficult to say. Probably you would rather say, okay, so what are the strong correlations with national culture? And that would be, like I said, free choice and control. That would be trust. It would be what was I thinking? The extent to which you have a social network, that would be really important as well for well-being, for people in general. We know that. So social relationships, that's very important. And then you look at work, well, then you look into, the work conditions. Obviously, in some organizational cultures, they are very tough in the sense that people are seen as, you can say, factors that work, right? In other cultures, you're much more employee oriented and so on. I think, yeah. So, yeah. Am I confusing more than?
No, it's interesting, Pernille and Martin, if you might step in here for a moment,
Sentence there, Pernilla.
because
Last.
I'm sorry, Martin.
No, I just missed the very last part of your final sentence there, Pernilla. The very last point that you made. I just missed that. My internet is a little bit glitchy.
What did I say? Am I? I think I said, am I confusing you? Or is it?
No,
Am I
it's
answering?
and then the internet broke.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not sure what I said, to be honest. So the last line. What did I say, Anthony? Do you remember?
I was listening, but I don't remember now. I can't remember what the last line was specifically, but it made sense to
No,
me.
neither can I. So okay.
But Martin, let me throw here an observation that I've recently. I'm doing this broadcast from a big hospital in Mother Island, and I realized now that the well-being, as you mentioned, Pernille, needs to be defined, right? So what's about work well-being, perhaps something else different than a personal well-being, and sometimes one goes against the other because, for instance, I understand that here when people go to have the meals in the restaurant, each professional group stays together, right? So doctors sit with doctors, nurses sit with nurses, and that's probably because my personal well-being commands that I want to be with my colleagues in profession. But the work well-being will improve definitely if these groups will sit in different professional groups tables, like a doctor, nurses, and they would be able to better talk about what is all about their work activity, not leisure activity. So isn't this a contradiction between a personal well-being and work well-being? Being the later, that we have to do an extra effort to build work well-being.
I suppose it's a question that I find interestingly difficult to answer. I was just reflecting on it, and and this is a bad sign for my psychological health, I suspect. I was thinking I'm not sure how I distinguish between home well-being and work well-being. It's it's not like, I hope it's not that I'm just a total work obsessive. I hope not, but it's just whether that whether that distinction can be can be so tightly drawn. So if I think about someone who does a less all-absorbing job, like my wife, who works for the government here in Belgium, um, she does have the ability to just like close the laptop lid and come home. The type of work she does doesn't require her to write policy papers in the evenings or read emails or whatever. But like good days and bad days are definitely different. And a weekend where she has a difficult week coming up is different from a week where she's got some time off. I think that's true for everyone as well. So I don't know how much that's driven by culture and how much that's driven by personality, but I'm sure that if her team's culture were less open and welcoming and fun and interesting, she would probably have more bad days and fewer good days. So I think that the culture that drives people's mood versus the culture that kind of drives people's well-being rather, versus the culture that, for example, opens up on difficult conversations or like looks for accountability or in a negative sense looks for blame. Those sorts of things. I think they're quite intimately linked. And I don't know how much you can unscramble the eggs.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point for sure. And what was prompting my original question about the relative impact of national culture versus organizational culture was the idea of time scale. So national culture, I would suggest, is relatively static, relatively. So it takes a very, very long time for a national culture to shift. And it might start shifting because of economic factors, socio-economic development factors, legal factors. But I think you will be measuring those kind of changes over decades as opposed to over, let's say, years. Whereas organizational culture can shift, I would suggest, almost on a quarterly basis. For a lot of commercial organizations, they could shift almost quarterly, depending on how the financial performance is going. If we look a little bit broader into societal organizations, so not necessarily commercial, they would tend to take their markers, I would suggest, from the overall economic framework, if you like. So the cycle of cultural change within the organizations within those types of organizations might be a little bit longer. It might run over a year or 2 or 3 or 4 years. But so my proposition would be that a serious driver of individual well-being is actually the organizations that we work in, as opposed to the national cultural dimensions that we talked about previously. So here's an observation that, and again, I just invite you to disagree or otherwise. My own personal observations in the last 5 to 6, maybe 10 years, organizations I've interacted with, people have tended to be more and more stressed, more and more kind of fretful, more and more angst, more and more less certain about their place in things, a less sense of permanency. And I just wonder to what extent is that driven by the organizations or driven by society or driven by the national cultures. I suppose that's where I'm now. I may be wrong. Maybe my perceptions are wrong, but I'd put that out there as an observation and just invite you to give your sense from your own experiences. Would you share that sense or would you have a different sense?
I would say that I would share that sense. Again, continuing on, what are we looking at? Which industry, which tree, and so on. But it generally is. And we, of course, also know that during Corona, people then had a difficulty, switching. Anthony, you were mentioning your wife from the work. When are you in the office? Not when you're home and things like that. And stressful.
I think I'm losing Pernille.
Yeah, I was losing Pernille there as well.
She's we lost her for a moment.
Anthony, your connection is still good. Did you catch?
Yeah, it seems to be good. No, I didn't. I think she froze when she froze for you as well. But in answer to the question, picking up that question about national cultures, I do agree with you that national culture is a lot slower to move than organisational culture. I mean, I've been running Demstock for 15 years, and we've had several different cultures, and I've actually hired people specifically to try and shift organisational cultures to the place where I felt we needed to be in senior roles, and we were in the middle of another shift as well. So I think that's absolutely right. Where I'm uncertain is which has the upper hand, the kind of the person's culture or the national culture. Because we have a very international organisation. So I'm sitting in Brussels, which is where maybe a third of the team are based, but the rest of the team are scattered all over Europe, and of course they come into us from their own national cultures. We don't hire them in Belgium and then send them out. And that has been, I think, quite interesting in terms of similarities and differences. And I think that they are probably more similar than an average Spanish, Polish, Italian, Swedish, etc. person would be, because they're attracted by our work. They like the flexibility of freelancing. They're open to thinking about democratic participation and citizenship. They are like, probably on the ocean scale. They're very high O's. Very, very open to experience. I think that creates a particular culture. But I also think that if I look back 5 years to when we were predominantly a UK-based company, the British culture in the organisation was very dominant. And obviously, you can tell from my voice, I'm not a native Belgian. There is now a sense in which we are shifting towards a more European culture, but a kind of averaged out multinational European culture, rather than something that's a little bit more, rather than something that's very specific. I mean, like maybe a bit more Belgian than anywhere else, because so many of the team are Belgian, but still, very, very kind of flexible and very varied. And I think that does attract people who see themselves in that culture. So we possibly don't get if I was running, God forbid, a major bank that had branches in every country, you know, that would be something which I think would have, where there will be a lot more local culture being built. At the moment, people kind of, we're an organisation of like 25, 30 people. People are generally kind of imbibing our culture and not having teams in which they're generally working all the time with people of the same culture as them.
Yeah.
Pranil, I think your connection. We are not listening to you, Pranil.
I'm not
Maybe
getting you there at all, Pranil.
yeah, you are not reaching us. Yeah, I'm not sure, Pranil, if you're listening to us. Maybe if you could try to switch your internet device on your home or wherever you are in the office, because the bandwidth we are receiving from you is not stable. Maybe if you do a reset on the router or something, it will fix things.
I'm still not getting anything.
No, yeah,
You're still not getting anything.
we are getting you without audio right now. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Actually, Anthony, your point there raises another really interesting question in my mind. So your observation that over, say, a 5, maybe 7-year time frame, that you could perceive a cultural shift within the organization as the geographic shift in your personnel changed. Do you have a correlating sense of the shift in people's well-being? Or broadly, has the well-being stayed broadly the same, do you think?
I think it's moved in different directions at different times. So just to give a little bit of the backstory, we're mainly a UK-focused company. Yeah. And then in 2016, because of Brexit, we moved the headquarters to Belgium, and we started growing in Europe rather than growing in the UK. So having been maybe 10 people in the UK, we ended up at about 40 people overall. We've shrunk back a little since with projects closing. But fundamentally, that kind of spurt of growth was very international because we were doing a multi-centred project where we had to have people in lots of cities. Okay. So the consequence of that is that we got a very rapid growth, but a very rapid multiculturalism within the organisation. And I do think it was, going back to that point about, like, is it about the nationality or is it about who you are? Some people who came in were very unprepared for what working remotely for an international organisation is like. And they were kind of community workers, and they'd worked on democracy, like on the streets, and they thought they'd be able to do the same as that, but with an organisation in Belgium paying the wages and directing the work. But of course, it's much more than that, doing remote working for an organisation. I think some people found it very challenging, some people loved it. I think that the people who loved it stayed, the people who found it challenging didn't, for obvious reasons. And I think that was then something that drove a culture where people were actively fired up by the fact that you were working in multiple multinational project teams, and that you were always working in English or maybe occasionally in French or Dutch. You know, and that those sorts of kind of international teams were the thing that was attractive about the organisation, and they would tell their friends who were interested in those sorts of projects, oh, you should come and work for DEMSOC because there's some really interesting international work on climate. And some of those things, I think, then there's a skew, makes it sound negative. I'm not being negative about it at all.
Sure.
But they kind of shape the organisation into something that, you know, we had after COVID. Our first post-COVID team away day was in Marseille. I think everyone who was with us at that time sees that as like a really kind of joyous occasion because we were all together and we hadn't seen each other for so long, and we'd been on teams so much because we were used to seeing each other every 6 months or so. And I think that was the moment probably where we had maximum well-being. But then in the moments during the pandemic, but also during the period where new arrivals were starting remotely, that was probably one of our lowest well-being points, because you did have then some people really struggling, and you just couldn't get yourself to, you know, a Central European city or to Italy or to Scandinavia to kind of have the conversation face to face that you might have wanted to have.
Yeah, and I suppose isn't that one of the downsides, I suppose, we've all experienced out of the whole pandemic, is that it had such an unexpected and such a profound impact on every aspect of our work, of our personal, of our family, that maybe it's really difficult to separate out what has been 8 to 15 years. So there is a difficulty in finding a reasonable benchmark against which we can have a shared conversation about something like the question we're talking about: culture impact on well-being.
I must confess that you broke up a bit, so I didn't hear the middle part.
Yeah.
Of what you were saying.
Yeah, we are having some a little bit of the breakouts connection, but Anthony, taking here on this opportunity from Martin, and so DEMSOC intervention in the society is also directed to improve participation inside organizations. And would that participation inside organization impact workplace well-being? Anna, your experience.
We have had a bit of a mixed. We haven't had a huge amount of work that's to do directly with internal democracy, because obviously because internal democracy and internal culture are rather different things. We have definitely had a conversation definitely done a lot of work where we've worked inside organisations to help them understand what cultural shifts they need to make to open up to citizen participation and to deal with citizen voice in a more constructive way, maybe. And I think in those spaces, you definitely see that there is what's the best way of putting this? There are kind of phases and groups for some of these cultural changes. So I remember maybe the clearest example is actually not from our own work, but it's from me working in government on digital issues. That the culture change that happened in digitization was one that really started with a few people who were quite frustrated, who felt like the digital revolution, the internet, was something that grew outside government workspaces for the most part. It grew in universities, and lots of people who went through university in the 90s, like I did, came out really excited by the potential, and then others also like me, went into the civil service and found that we had to ask like a head of department for permission to have an email address that the rest of the world could send emails to. Now that's something that it would be astonishing now, to think that. But of course, that culture didn't change by a prime ministerial decree or by something like overnight. It changed from a few people who were really unsatisfied with that, trying a collective approach to changing the organisation from within. And those kind of positive deviants in the old language of culture change, they were quite lonely sometimes, and it was quite it was a furrowed plough. It was quite nice being the person who understood the internet in a team that wasn't really doing all internet things. But the problem was, of course, no one else really did. So they really didn't understand why you might want to use this, kind of new social media website. What's all that about? Isn't it just for wasting time on? And that kind of shift over time was driven by a few people who really wanted to make things happen, finding each other and setting up organizations that were then highly influential in developing the culture for future managers. So I'm a great believer in finding your future managers and changing their culture first, because they are the people who in a few years' time are going to be reaching the levers of power, and you want to use them in the right way. I think if you start approaching CEOs, it's great, but you maybe have like a 5-year runway for the culture change to take, whereas if you approach someone in kind of 10 years into their career, you've got 20 or 30 years of runway. I think that some of those initiatives that I've seen, not that I've driven so much, but I've seen and I've been part of, it is so much about the shift from why would I do that to why wouldn't I do that, and that for me is the really big cultural move that we've seen. We've seen it with digital, and I think we're seeing it now with citizen voice as well. Organisations that even 3 or 4 years ago I would have said are just totally uninterested in the sorts of things that we would be working on, have suddenly got interested, and they have suddenly started thinking about how they open up to citizens, how they open up to users, how do they open up to the public in a more constructive way. And I think it's driven partly by the climate change debates and by ESG, economic, social, and governance activities in big companies. But I think it's also driven by the expectations that people have. I don't even when being an NGO is not always the easiest thing. It's you're always struggling for money. You're always worrying about the next paychecks. You're always worrying about whether you're having enough impact, and you're always filling in forms and forms and forms and forms. It's not glamour work. No one would mistake it for glamour. But the thing that I've noticed is that even when it's been difficult, we've never had a drop in the quality of applications that we've had. We've always been able to have our pick between people coming out of university or people early in their careers, because we offer something that's really speaking to their cultural values in the moment, around control and around openness and around being able to make a positive difference in the world. And I think that is really, really interesting, because when I was a young undergraduate, young postgraduate in the 90s, people went to the city, or they went into big organisations. And I don't want to tell a story that someone else is to tell, but I was sitting with a friend of mine who was a civil servant, my age, joined civil service around the same time as me, and who was a black woman who grew up on an estate in South London, and she still lives in the neighbourhood and she works with young people's groups in that part of London. And it really stuck with me that she said, when I was young, I'm working with like 15-year-olds. When I was their age, I saw people in the civil service and I saw people in government. And I thought, that's where the power is. I'm going to go and take that power over. I'm going to make my voice heard in those spaces. But the people that she's working with now are totally uninterested in that. They want to set up their own micro campaigns or their own little initiatives or their own kind of approach or their own social enterprise, because that's how they see change being made. That's how they see the most productive pathway to change that doesn't require them to subordinate themselves for 15 years to a corporate hierarchy and the expectation or hope that you get to the top in the end. And I think that's a really striking challenge to some of the questions around culture, because it doesn't make companies and big organisations think about how they are opening up to internal voices. And we've been involved in the UK again in a few conversations at an early stage with companies about how do they create these kind of internal, more democratic is a tricky word, because obviously shareholders is a shareholder democracy, but shareholders are not necessarily always operating in such a democratic way. But similarly within companies, there are, like in governments, limits and frames within which democracy can operate, in places where it just doesn't. And I think that within that and within those frames, there's quite a lot of exploration. There's quite a lot of interesting work going on to try and open up those kind of opportunities for people to make something for themselves. Unilever was a good example. I mean, a few years ago now, but I worked with someone in Unilever who was trying to effectively set up an internal social enterprise on social economic and governance work. And it's just really interesting that a massive organisation like Unilever can have these little cells of innovation within them, and then I must say I don't know what happened to it, but as an idea, I thought it was really powerful. But more importantly, as a kind of cultural marker, that Unilever is the sort of place where we want you to be able to pursue these things for yourself, in the interests of the collective of the company as a whole. I thought it was really interesting.
Just as a matter of interest, Anthony, what kind of timescale did that happen in? Was that a couple of years ago? Was that very recent?
It was longer than that. It was maybe 8-9 years ago. So it was quite early. It was quite early in that sort of thinking.
And actually, so that answer now connects two dots that from what you've said there have very strongly formed in my mind. So your personal experience going back, say 15, say 20 years ago, when you came out of college, you went into organizations, you gave the example of the personal email, and that sounded to me like that was a bottom up kind of ask for a shift in culture. Move forward to your case study of Unilever, where you said there were pockets of, let's call it innovation, cultural innovation happening, and the organization was keen to foster that, to harness that, capture that. Let's now fast forward to today, to social media today. And let me give an analogy. Back 15, 20 years ago, there was a very small garden hose with a relatively light trickle looking to spread culture. In the Unilever example, actually, there's multiple garden hoses with a little bit more power, but still there are multiple hoses. I would suggest that our current social media, in the space of literally 10 years, has turned multiple fire hoses onto all of our organizations. And the consequence, and this is just a proposition, but the consequence of that is a significant amount of confusion as to, well, what are our cultural values? What are our cultural norms? And are we in an environment now where that well-being question that I put a little while ago, that if my proposition is correct, that there's been a progressive, slow decline in general well-being within organizations, are we getting to a point where organizations will actually have to focus on the well-being question in order to engender cultures that are what they are seeking to develop? And the driver of that, I would proposition, is around the multiple fire hoses that social media kind of targets onto every organization simultaneously. I know I've used a lot of mixed metaphors there,
No,
but
no, 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 no. I do understand what you're saying, and I think that is absolutely true. But I also think it is it's starting to change in another revolution. I think that's going to be driven by the shift of social media to a more AI-based system, or the threats that AI brings to social media. Like the most worried person about ChatGPT really ought to be Mark Zuckerberg, and the second most worried ought to be Elon Musk, because what social media has done is created an image of unfiltered voice. But if unfiltered voice can be artificial intelligence generated voice, and you suddenly can't trust the authenticity of the voices that you hear on social media, how much can you trust social media, and how does that change people's expectations and attitudes? I mean, I can certainly imagine that Twitter is the classic example, in that it is a very small section of the population, but it's quite a large section of journalists and quite a large section of opinion formers and policymakers. So in my world, Twitter is far more important than Facebook for messaging, but Facebook is far more important than Twitter for talking to the general public. If both of those mediums get corrupted, I mean, not in a money-changing hand sense, but if the authenticity of their voice is reduced, or the perceived authenticity of their voice is reduced because everyone isn't sure whether it's a real person or a chat or a bot, that I think would be really interesting. The effect of that would be really interesting. Whether you go back to a more kind of human-centered authenticity, and like video and other things, but even that's very very fakeable very soon. But or if you go back to more networks of personal connection. I mean, back in the day, many years ago, there was a social network called Path, which only allowed you to have 50 friends. And that kind of those sorts of very small groups, or groups where there's very high levels of trust. I mean, those sorts of things I think are potentially a real challenge to some of those fire hoses, or to some of those like multiple fire hoses that trained on the organisation. And it may be a moment in which organisations are able to take a little bit more control of their culture, or of their cultural messaging at least, by using some of the platforms that are available to them away from Facebook, Twitter, and to some extent LinkedIn.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting juncture, I think, that we are arriving at. I don't have the answers to where it might go to, but I think that's a really interesting proposition, Anthony, that the authenticity of those voices, if we start to doubt the individualistic voice, and if we think that the voice that I'm hearing, I don't know where it's coming from, if that drives us back to more interpersonal connection, more individual connection, that could be a really, really interesting development, and how it would manifest in the social media spheres, but more particularly, how it would then manifest in the workplace. So instead of sending emails, maybe people would start talking to each other again at the water cooler or at the photocopier, but we don't need photocopiers. So that social club has diminished. But hopefully everybody will still drink a cup of coffee. So hopefully we might still get to maybe have the water cooler moment or have the espresso moment. But certainly it sounds like we could be at a junction point where culture and well-being are both likely to shift, and hopefully the positive culture shifts might just raise the boat of the well-being to bring us back to someplace we, perhaps you and I coming from a similar generation, although I'm a few years ahead of you, but certainly there's a trajectory, I think, that both of us are identifying here in the conversation, that maybe things are bottoming out, and maybe there's good scope now for a slow picking up on both org culture and on the whole well-being impact that it would have.
definitely. And Pernilla, are you there?
Yeah,
Because
I
I
am
think
here.
you
I
are
just
on
didn't turn on the
video.
video because I thought, okay, I'm not sure with the. I never used this program before, but no, I agree with you, Martin, that the overall, you can say, well-being is sort of going a little bit down. But one of the reasons I think that a lot of companies, at least when we're talking more developed countries, will focus on that a lot is because of the UN, the sustainability goals. And it's one of the goals, of course, or it actually relates to several. But, and companies, well, the thing is, the company will simply perish if they don't focus on it, especially in certain cultures, of course. So I think that's going to be a big push, you can say. Yeah. And then I don't know. Well, it was a comment to something we talked about earlier, but I think it's important also now because we're talking about health research and well-being to be aware of. Yes, with social media, I think also that has contributed to mental health becoming worse, and culture impacts both subjective health and objective health. So it's very important to be aware of. Yeah, yeah. I don't know.
Ah, thank you for your inputs, Pernilla. I put you here on a tag on audio, so our viewers can actually see that it's your voice
It is.
on the screen. Unfortunately, yeah. Uh, yes, and dear colleagues, guest speakers, we are approaching the deadline for our broadcast. Martin, as you know, 50 minutes is perhaps too much, and we are losing followers, which I believe I please have still many of you following on LinkedIn, and a quiet chat today, no comments from the
Yeah.
viewers. But I am sure after this live recording, we'll still get some viewers, and please comment on the feeds. We're here to answer you. Over to you, Martin, maybe for the conclusions.
Yeah, I'll have to keep this one very short, Paul. Thank you both for some really interesting and provocative ideas. I suppose key point that we started with was culture operates nationally, organizationally, and even there are multiple subcultures. Well-being, tricky to define, difficult to track, very personal. It's personal to individuals. It's then personal to organizations. So challenging to make a correlation. So that would be my overall sense. Couple of things that I think came out of it. The whole question of the impact of national culture on organizational cultures, the timeline over which they might happen, where the shifts might be changing, have to be taken into account. We have all had an aberration, which was the pandemic, that took 2 years to more or less see us through it, making it even more challenging to make an assessment or a firm grounding of the impact of our culture on well-being. But I'd summarize it in the very last point, Anthony, that you made, which I think is one. It's an optimistic point, but it's the whole question of the impact of social media on our organizations. My analogy of the garden hose from 15 or 20 years ago to the multiple fire hoses of today, which is largely due to social media. But perhaps we are at the very bottom of that well-being curve, with the possibility to increase positively on well-being. But it's likely to need a shift, which you identified, Anthony, of does social media itself now need to change because of AI, because of the lack of clarity as to whose voice are we hearing? Is that likely to drive people back into individual personal connections? And from that, we would hope that personal well-being and collective well-being would start to actually have an upward trajectory into the coming years.
Absolutely, Martin and Anthony and Pernilla. I know that you are still here with us on audio. Final word for our viewers. What piece of advice will you give to the audience that will be listening and following us? I would say managers, chief executives, even consultants that are listening to us right now. Piece of advice for how culture impacts on well-being.
I would say go and find the new arrivals and talk to them without judgment about what their expectations are of what their life will be like in your organization.
Yeah. Okay, I would say it differs on the level again, but national cultures, I would say focus on education. So for the countries, it's about focusing on education because that's the only way we can really lift them. Organizational culture, measure organizational culture. It can be done. It can be, you can actually set the organizational culture. You know which levers to change. If you, for instance, want to change to a more supportive organizational culture of well-being, and personal culture then would be to hold on to your relationships no matter, and I'm not talking social media. I mean, we know it's one of the most important things, and actually it is the case that people are becoming more individualist, and that's a problem because in the very individualist cultures, depending on other aspects of culture, we know that if you're lonely in those cultures, you're very lonely. And so those would be my three pieces of advice for the national level, organizational level, and the individual level.
Fantastic, fantastic,
Super.
Pernilla.
Well said.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, everyone, and thanks for watching. Thank you so much, Anthony, Pernilla, and Martin, for being here. It's really great to have this hour every month to have these in-depth conversations. I hope that our viewers also enjoyed our company today. And we're closing the stream now. Goodbye, and see you next month for
Ciao.
a new topic to be announced.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thanks very much.
Nice to
Goodbye.
meet you, all of you, and goodbye to
Thank
all
you.
our listeners. Bye.